So let's talk about a few common rules errors on the tabletops of 10th edition Warhammer 40k, with a look at 9 common rules mistakes and errors. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about a few common rules mistakes and errors in 40k. In general, when getting going with Warhammer, there's a bit of a learning curve. The core rules are plenty of stuff to digest on their own, never mind all the changes, erratas and updates Games Workshop seems to like making to them over the course of the edition. And even beyond that, there do tend to be a bunch of things that just aren't enormously clear to newer players when they're starting out, and I thought it would be worth going through a few common examples here. I'll talk through a few more basic and a few more involved ones, but feel free to let me know any other things that have tripped you up or your friends up in games when you've been playing, down in the comments below. First up, one thing that's not enormously clear when you start playing 10th edition 40k is exactly how units and their attached characters interact, both in terms of keywords for the unit and also for datasheet abilities and which models they apply to. I feel like it's just a little bit less obvious given that it's not really something that tends to get focused on in the rules and maybe comes up just occasionally, but basically the majority of datasheet abilities will equally apply to any character that's part of the unit as well, and the combined unit will have all the keywords that the models inside them have, even if not every single model has those keywords. In terms of unit abilities, it means that one slightly counterintuitive thing is that squads can sometimes buff their characters, and sometimes in pretty major ways. It often tends to matter most for damage dealing special rules, saying things like models in this unit get reroll wounds or something like that, and that absolutely does apply to attached characters, provided it's not very specifically worded, such as the named infantry components of this unit get that rule, and it's a more general term such as models in this unit get the rule. This can be really big for a bunch of attached characters. Sword Brethren can give High Marshal Helbrecht a +1 damage, that's kind of massive for his sweep attacks. Deathcore of Krieg might be able to give an attached Primaris Psyker their +1 to hit and wound if the unit gets depleted. And Assault Intercessors are another common one, giving an attached captain or lieutenant their reroll wound rolls if they happen to be fighting an enemy unit on an objective. I've certainly seen plenty of people hesitant to take the benefit of that, but it is the way that it works. On the same way, keywords also apply to the entire unit for anything that checks keyword by unit and not by model. Lots of stratagems tend to target keyworded units as opposed to models with that keyword, and it can have some important interactions. Say for example, Azrael can make a Hellblaster's unit Deathwing for the purposes of the Inner Circle Task Force, because Azrael himself has the keyword. Not entirely sure if that one was intentional, but it is the way that it works. And the Neurotyrant for the Tyranids is an important one now he can attach to Zoanthropes. He's got the monster keyword, and the rule states that monster units are allowed to use Big Guns Never Tire. So essentially he confers the ability for Zoanthropes to fire when in melee. Again, if an ability or stratagem just targeted models of a certain keyword though, it wouldn't necessarily apply to attached characters or the other way around. Another common source of confusion is Overwatch and the Big Guns Never Tire interaction. Often the question is whether or not a vehicle that's in melee is able to fire Overwatch, maybe targeting at something else moving up the board when they'd be able to fire normally in the shooting phase due to the Big Guns Never Tire rule. I feel like this intuitively feels like they should be able to, given that being within engagement range of enemy units doesn't stop them firing from normally, but the way that the out-of-phase rules interactions work, it's actually not allowed. Big Guns Never Tire really clearly states that it only applies during the controlling player's shooting phase, so really quite a specific rule to there, and that also means that any other things that could allow you to fire out of sequence can't be used if you happen to be in melee. Say for example the Astra Militarum Lehman Russ tank commander firing on death. Basically it means though that say if this Hellhound was in melee with this Orc boy, you wouldn't be able to fire Overwatch at some other Gretchen wandering by, even if it really wanted to do so. And interestingly enough, it also means that vehicles can't shoot at enemy units that have charged into combat with them, so you can't fire Overwatch after the unit has made base contact if you couldn't see them before the charge, say if they've charged from behind terrain. This generally applies in the same way to pistols as well, and basically it means that the only time that you can usually fire Overwatch after an enemy's made a charge move might be if they were an enemy monster or vehicle and they charged into combat, as they're still targetable for other things even outside of the shooting phase. I feel like it really doesn't help too much that the Big Guns Never Tire rules are just very unclearly worded in my opinion, and I guess Games Workshop felt the same to some extent, given that they actually had an FAQ for it in the designer's commentary, clarifying the way that it doesn't work with out-of-phase shooting. Before we move on, I thought I'd just mention the sponsor for today's video, which is Kiwi. They asked me to share their Kickstarter for a 40k Battlefield Organizer, a 3D printed Battlebox that has a bunch of handy features including storage and display things for cards, score and command point trackers, a dice tray, and a whole bunch of other storage compartments for tokens and counters and things. At time of release, the Kickstarter for this is going into its last 48 hours or so not too much longer for that if you want to get the STL files for this. It's essentially a 3D printed version of their physical Battlebox that they also sell. The idea being multiple interlocking layers that you can basically clip into each other and then swap around and tailor to your army's needs. I cycle back to mention them a little bit more at the end of the video, though feel free to check out the link in the video description if it looks like it could be of use to you. There's only a couple of days left. Getting back to 40k mistakes and errors though, and next up another really common cause of confusion is not knowing when reserves are supposed to arrive. Definitely something that was kind of common as a misunderstanding in previous editions of the game, and I was kind of surprised that Games Workshop didn't make it a little bit more obvious this time around. Again, they basically sort of have the Strategic Reserve and Deep Strike rules in one place, where it makes absolutely no mention of turn restrictions as to when they can turn up, but then in the vast majority of missions basically spelling out that reserves can only arrive in Battle Rounds 2 and Battle Round 3, no earlier and no later. Maybe just to give the option of certain game modes having them arrive at different times if it makes sense for say a narrative game or something. Having the two bits separated like that just really isn't too obvious though. I feel like a lot of newer players only ever learn when they're supposed to turn up by being corrected when they play in game. Maybe just a bit easier to learn by osmosis. The exception to this though is for any models that were on the board at some point and then returned to reserve. They're not bound by the same constraints. So say for example if you had a stratagem that took your jump inventory and put them back in Deep Strike, potentially if that was done during the opponent's turn 1, you could have them arrive in your reinforcement phase in your turn 1 if you went second, and the same if you did the same manoeuvre later in the game, they could still turn up on turn 4 or turn 5. They aren't just counted as destroyed or anything. I felt like that last bit was really quite ambiguous before they made it a bit more explicit in the Pariah Nexus missions. Another one that can sometimes throw people is what happens when a unit has both sustained hits and lethal hits, which I've seen people get wrong before in two different ways. When you have both going on a unit, each time you get a critical hit they trigger, usually on a 6 to hit. Sustained hits grant you the extra hit, and the lethal hit gives you an automatic wound. So normally if you have both of these going, then each 6 will give you one single automatic wound, and then one single hit on your target that you will need to roll to wound for. I've seen some people thinking that the two might stack, so you just take 2 automatic wounds because you basically get 2 hits and those hits have lethal hits, or try and apply the rules sequentially, so set 1 dice aside for the lethal hit and then add in another dice to count for the sustained hit, meaning that you've managed to get 3 hits out of the shot. Again, it might not be the most common thing that a lot of people have to deal with, so definitely some scope for some misplays while learning. Maybe a slightly broad one, but I feel like perhaps one of the most obvious ways that people make some mistakes in 40k is just the general order, sequencing and movement of the charge and fight phase. These things have very much been built up and developed over the course of 8th edition, 9th edition and now 10th edition. Games Workshop trying to make it more restrictive so there's less options for gamey shenanigans when you do them, though of course they're still possible to some extent. When charging, you need to make sure that your unit ends a move within 1 inches of engagement range of all the targets that you declared on. So it does mean that you can still complete a charge even if you can't get into base to base, and it means that deep strike charges go off on a 9 inches, not as some people accidentally play it as an 8 inches, as you basically have to be just over 9 inches away, not exactly 9 inches. With charging though, one thing that threw me a few times was that if a model can get into base to base, it absolutely has to. You can't just get into engagement range with some models and then move the rest more or less where you like in 9th edition. At least not if your miniature does actually have the option to base an enemy model. Otherwise, the sequence of unit activation can confuse people as well. There's basically 2 different phases of the fight phase. Everything with fight first strikes first, and if both players have units that have that, then you start with the non-charging player. So it means that if you charge a unit with fights first, usually the opponent's going to have the opportunity to hit with that before you, and then you go to the next step where you fight with anything else that doesn't have fights first, so usually things that haven't charged and were in ongoing combats, and again you start with a non-charging player there as well. Then pile-ins and consolidates are often just not really done too much or not done properly by a lot of people. Rather than being checked per unit, this one's checked per individual model. Each model needs to move closer to the closest enemy one, and again if you can base then you need to. And then consolidate can only be done in 10th edition if you're moving into engagement range or onto objectives, only if that's not possible, and follows similar rules to the pile-in. Between all that, it's just really quite a lot of slightly fiddly steps that each have their own different movement restrictions, and I feel like as a result quite a lot of people just wind up just broadly pushing their unit roughly into engagement range and then fighting with all of them just for simplicity. Sometimes it's perfectly possible to do that, but a lot of the time due to engagement range you might have units at the back of your squad that might not have been able to fight if you'd done it properly. Another common one is using command point rerolls on things that you're not allowed to. In 8th edition in particular, command point rerolls were incredibly de-restricted, being able to be used on basically anything and everything. But in 9th edition and 10th edition, it's now a very specific list. You can only use your rerolls on things out of the damage sequence, hits, wounds, damage results, or the number of attacks roll. You can use them on saving throws, advances and charges, where for charges, if you're rerolling dice, then you have to reroll both of them, and the same with the number of shots profile that say 3d6 shots, you'd have to reroll all 3 of them. And you can also do so on desperate escape and hazardous checks, which maybe feel like the most oddball ones out of all of them. Notably, there's a whole bunch of things that you aren't allowed to use command point rerolls on. Morale and battle shock tests are a common one that you could use on them in the past. It means that insane bravery is the only way to guarantee that you pass those, and you have to commit to it before time now. You can't use it on numbers of mortal wounds dealt, say with Typhus's ability when he strikes foes with mortal wounds at range. You can't use it on datasheet abilities like say this model gets back up on a 2+, or fires on death on a 2+. And you can't use it on feel no pain type throws, which technically is an ability, not really a save. That one maybe feels a little bit more arbitrary to me, but kind of important, as it would be very impactful if you could do that on one that was absolutely key. One that I've seen catch people out before is precision needing line of sight. I feel like this one just runs a little bit counter to a lot of the ways that 40k weapons deal damage. Generally, if you can see one model out of an infantry unit, then when you fire a bunch of firepower into that unit, all of them are viable targets for being shot down and killed. And the same for a unit where, say, if you've only got a few models into engagement range, those models can potentially kill things that aren't within engagement range of you if they're all part of the same locked together unit. Precision is one instance where it does matter though. You actually need to be able to get line of sight to the actual character model that you want to land your hits on. You can't just happen to see some of their bodyguard units and land the hits where they need to. It means that if you've got a character in a unit, then you could shield them from precision attacks by putting them out of line of sight behind a wall, even if the opponent can see the rest of your unit and they're out there doing aggressive things. As maybe another slight side point to this, if you've say got attached guard models like Marnius Calgar's Victrix Honor Guard, they can absolutely be used to tank damage to regular attacks. They aren't character models, even if they're attached to another unit kind of like them. It means that if you had Calgar and some Victrix guards in a unit of aggressors, those Victrix guards could be used to tank some las cannon hits on their 4+ invulnerable saves if you wanted. As they're not character miniatures, you can choose to allocate attacks as you'd see fit. Next up are a few specifics of how you roll dice, and one that can be a little bit annoying are grouping saves that shouldn't be grouped together. I've certainly seen the second example of this done quite a lot. First up though, if you've got a feel no pain type save and you're taking attacks from say a multi-damage weapon, say a 2-damage plasma gun, if you've got an infantry unit with multiple models, then usually you only need to roll those feel no pain saves one at a time as opposed to all together. The reason is that technically they come in sequentially one after the other. So you might say have a 2-damage attack that you save both saves of, and then one that you save only 1 out of 2 and the model still lives, and then you take a 2-damage attack and they fail both the saves for it and the model dies, and there's the potential for damage to get lost to a bit of overkill. If you just took all the damage results and rolled them all at once, then you'd have absolutely no overkill and probably give your opponent far more damage than they deserved, even if it can be a bit of a pain to roll things out individually. You can potentially speed up the process a little bit if you've got 1 wound infantry models with a feel no pain taking damage against multi-damager weapons. Say if you had some poxwalkers with their feel no pain taking a bunch of damage to attacks. If they took 10 hits, you could say roll 10 dice and have that represent the first of the 2 saves each model had to make, and then only roll the second save for the models that actually passed the first, so have a small chance at being alive. That can just be a little bit faster than literally rolling out 2 dice for each one of those attacks when the models are almost certainly going to die anyway. Perhaps if anything more commonly than that, are rolling a whole bunch of dice at an improved save, even if say you only had one model that could have got that improved save. Say for example the Space Marine squad takes a whole bunch of damage with AP2 weapons, there's 1 Space Marine in cover, and that means that they could be saving on a 4+, the rest will be a 5+. I've fairly often seen people just take say 10 dice and just roll all of those saves at a 4+, due to one model in the squad having a cover save, and then basically just picking out the models that they've failed that improved save on. In reality what you need to do in that situation will be to roll the dice one at a time, as you don't know at what point the save is going to be failed for that Space Marine in cover, and after that Battle Brother has fallen, the rest of the Space Marines should be saving on their 5+, rather than essentially having gained a 4+ save for all those attacks. I feel like that's one I've seen quite a few times, perhaps people not really understanding the difference between how models in a squad take saves. Maybe thinking if one model in the squad is in cover, then they all get it, when in reality you judge the models on an individual basis. Finally, another one that's caused perhaps a disproportionate amount of confusion is the firing deck rule. This one's just odd, as it treats basically embarked weapons in a slightly unusual way, basically counting the embarked unit's weapons as bolt-on weapons to the actual vehicle datasheet, with the units inside the transport effectively remaining kind of entirely off the board and unable to do anything else. They did also feel the need to errata it with one-shot weapons as well, basically just trying to solve that entire issue by just forbidding using things like demo charges or other one-shot weapons while embarked, rather than going down the route of saying if you fire the one-shot weapon from the vehicle, then it just gets used for the squad inside of it. Possibly the biggest impacts of getting rules wrong could be using firing deck in Overwatch, when again, like Big Guns never tire, it's very specifically just for your own shooting phase, so you can't say have a Chimera with 2 heavy flamers and cast chance with flamethrowers inside of it, and have a ridiculously scary Overwatch tank with that. And also, if the unit had any special rules or any character buffs while they're inside the transport, they can't make use of those, as it's actually the transport doing the firing, and not technically the unit inside at all. They've got nothing to do with it. Anything that buffs the transport could be useful though, say if you had a Tech Marine or an Orc Mech or something that can give the vehicle a +1 to hit, that could be used to improve ballistic skill of the weapons, but in general it usually tends to affect things more negatively than positively, say if you had Space Marines with a Lieutenant embarked and firing out of an Impulsor's firing deck, you wouldn't be able to get the benefit of the lethal hits. In any case, I'll leave that there for the 40k mistakes and errors and things. I'm sure there's plenty more examples I could have talked about. Feel free to let me know any other ones that you've thought down in the comments below, and any mistakes or errors I might have made in this video. Always the possibility for that when talking about some slightly edge case 40k rule things. If I've ironically made any errors myself, I'll certainly post them in a pinned comment. Finally, just to finish up though, as said earlier, I'll cycle back to talk about the video sponsor, which is Kiwi, the New Zealand-based company that makes a sort of battle command centre for playing 40k games, with places to display mission cards, score counters, dice trays, and plenty more. Their main product is this MDF Battlebox that they've sold quite a lot of in the past and has been quite popular, and their current Kickstarter campaign that's fully funded now is them essentially making a 3D printed version of this that people around the world can print off in FDM. The idea behind this one is that it's made in modular layers that can click in and slide into each other. The top layer having these score tracker things, where there's different wheels to represent your score on the primary and secondary objectives, plus numbers of command points and a battle round tracker as well. It maybe keeps things a little bit more organised, both with scores, dice and tape measures and things that you can all carry around in one box, as opposed to have them loose in your bag or whatever. As mentioned, the Kickstarter's entering its last 48 hours or so. If you want the STL files for this, then it's $22, £17 or €19, and they have a few upgraded tiers as well. And you basically get the STL files for the FDM, all designed to be printed super simply and support free. Seems that this one's been kind of wildly popular over the last few months or so, 550 backers, and it's raised £14,000, so very much past their 400 goal of funding. And I've got all the stretch goals unlocked as well, such as the dice tray, the datasheet card holder, and a few other bits and bobs. In any case, feel free to check them out, links down in the video description, and a big thank you to Kiwi for sponsoring the video. In any case though, let me know any 40k errors that you've been making in 10th edition so far, or if you've seen commonly played with other people. Look forward to hearing any insights down in the comments below. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the 40k news and discussion videos coming. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep the videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.